What'd you say?
You went to
Good,
the office today? You are quite the man.
No,
good
I'm not.
afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the House Environment and Transportation Committee for December 9th. We are having a briefing today on ins and outs of residential development. I know we're a little out of practice, but please try to mute when you are not being recognized. We have 4 panels we're going to go through. We will take Q&A between each panel if members want to press the raise hand function. This is our first meeting since Speaker Jones announced she was stepping down as Speaker, so I just want to thank her for all the amazing work, not only for the people of Maryland and the full House, but this committee in particular, helping us as we worked on things like the Climate Solutions Now Act, the governor's housing package, some pretty comprehensive ethics legislation last session, transportation funding, and the other issues we've all been working on over the past 6 years of her speakership. And of course, I don't want to get too far ahead of real world events, but spoiler alert, I think most of us know who the next speaker is going to be. She's going to do an amazing job. Chair Pena-Melnick is our neighbor across the hall, and no one works harder and with a bigger heart, and is going to do terrific work. And I know we all congratulate her and look forward to supporting her in the work ahead, as she will be supporting us in the work on this committee, which is awesome. With that, we are going to jump right into our panels on this significant topic of ins and outs of residential development. We will start with the Department of Housing and Community Development, Secretary Day, and Haley Lemieux, the Director of Office of Policy Development. Secretary Day, ready when you are.
Chair, thank you so much for having us today. Give me just a second as I'm going to try to share my screen, if that's all right with you.
Yep, let us know if it's not working.
Let's see if they're full screen.
And colleagues, I know Chair Barve was very committed to this point I'm going to make. If you are not in a place where you should be on camera, please turn your camera off. And we know you'll be listening to us very carefully. Secretary Day, please go ahead when you're ready.
Excellent. Can everyone see that okay?
Yep, we can see it.
Excellent. All right. Well, again, Mr. Chair, Vice Chair Boyce, distinguished members of the committee, thank you so much for having me today. For the record, my name is Jake Day. I serve as Secretary of Housing and Community Development for our beloved state. And it is great to be with you today. I'm sure this will be the first of many times that I am before this esteemed committee during the 2026 General Assembly session and these prelude events. At the committee's request, I'm here today to provide an overview of the housing development landscape in Maryland, process, problems, and potential solutions. And while I think the role that most people are likely familiar with respect to this agency that I lead is as a lending institution for income-restricted housing, this briefing is really meant to provide a broader assessment of Maryland's current housing production. So I want to just open by saying this. The housing crisis and its origins and its solutions are not very mysterious. This is really a conversation, I think, about whether or not we are willing to take as a state the bold actions necessary to fix it. The general sense that we don't know how to solve it, I think, is really a distraction to avoid the hard work that it takes to produce enough housing to house the people who call Maryland home, who, by the way, I think have to use that term loosely, given their housing condition or situation. And we must also recognize that the consequences of inaction are twofold. One, we'll continue to see the most vulnerable people left in the most undignified and unsafe housing situations, increasingly meaning they will be unhoused, particularly thanks to the changes proposed by HUD recently. And two, we will continue to watch our own peer states and neighbor states solve the housing crisis for their markets, bring housing costs down in their jurisdictions, and grow their population and economy, and will fall further behind, something that none of us want. Second, I also want to note that As I mentioned, you may be familiar with our role as a lending institution, but government-financed income-restricted housing development is an important part, but not the only part of the policy reforms needed to address the housing supply and affordability crisis, which at their core require more housing of all types, require the market to produce more units of smaller size and of lower cost to buyers and renters alike. Let's see. There we go. Just want to make sure that I know how to work the controls here. Okay, here's the key takeaway. Maryland is not building enough homes and has not been building enough homes for more than 15 years. After the boom and subsequent bust of the housing bubble and the resulting foreclosure crisis around 2008 to 2010, Maryland stopped building homes at the level it had before. And you'll see charts like this for most states. Now, we're also seeing more states picking up at this time. Maryland's not one of them, but from the 2008 mark and the trajectory of the curve forward, that is a pretty typical curve for most states. Compared to 2008, Maryland issues 40% less residential building permits annually today. And as the chart indicates, while many may think the pandemic caused this problem, the reality is this is happening a decade before COVID hit, and it's a decline in production that has contributed to a housing gap of almost 100,000 units. And that's just the amount of units that we need to, again, properly house Maryland's current population. That is, by the way, among the more conservative estimates of that figure of the housing gap. This chronic underbuilding has made housing more expensive in Maryland, and Marylanders are feeling the impact on their budgets and their wallets every month. Half of Maryland renters are cost burdened, which means they are paying more than a third of their monthly income for housing. Surging prices have put the American dream of home ownership beyond the reach of many Marylanders as well. Only 49% of Maryland households could afford Maryland's median home price in 2022. And that's down from 75% in 2000. And as home ownership becomes less attainable and as renters remain cost burdened, that means most people can't afford to live in the neighborhood where they grew up, and they also can't afford to transition from rentership to home ownership. Marylanders, particularly young Marylanders, can't afford to rent or own a home here, so they're leaving. They're going to jurisdictions where they can find a more affordable home, a more affordable housing product. According to current polling, 91% of younger full-time workers in our state feel homeownership in Maryland is too expensive and ultimately out of reach. 42% of younger renters are considering leaving Maryland due to housing costs. And ultimately, housing affordability is a greater concern than commute times for those renters, those voters. Because we're not losing our young workers and their families just to the housing boom or tax-friendly states like Florida or Texas, we're losing them to our neighbors, Delaware and West Virginia, and to a greater extent, Pennsylvania and Virginia. They're willing to endure a longer commute to their job in Maryland because there are more plentiful and affordable housing opportunities just across the border. Fact remains, Maryland has not been hemorrhaging jobs. Maryland has been hemorrhaging households. To attract and retain younger workers and grow Maryland's economy, we need to provide more plentiful, varied, and affordable housing opportunities in Maryland. We need to build more homes. So, what's the process for building a home in Maryland? Simplify it. And these are processes that need to be actually simplified, not just in diagram, but I'll simplify it with these 4 steps, basically. First, you have to find a place to build the home. Through zoning and other land use practices, government controls both the location where homes can be built and what types of homes can be built there. Single-family detached, townhomes, apartment communities, etc. The private market influences the availability and cost of land in these locations, obviously. Second, you have to find money to finance the construction. A lot of these costs, rent and sale prices, as well as construction, operating, debt equity ratios, those are outside of our control. But government has an important role to play and can influence these things. Third, you must get approval to build. Both state and local, control the approval and permitting process and influence it with policy decisions that are either made at the county or municipal level or at the state level. And finally, you must build the thing. You must start construction. Four seemingly simple steps, but those simple steps belie the multiple, complex, and sometimes cumbersome processes within housing development. For example, let's just break out simple step number 2, financing. When building market rate housing, particularly rental housing, developers are going to seek to generate enough rental income to cover all expenses. And that's going to include things like ongoing operating costs, like maintenance, property management, property taxes, et cetera, covering the construction costs themselves, so land costs, hard costs for materials, soft costs, labor, government taxes and fees, and repayment of any construction loans and all the interest on those construction loans that were taken during the period of development. And a positive return for their investors. They want to make money, and lower returns aren't attractive because these investors can make alternatives and much less risky investments instead of housing development, like purchasing shares of the S&P 500 or investing in housing in places that are easier to build and can build faster and with higher returns. Supply and demand for available units sets pricing in the rental and for sale market. So if I'm a seller and I'm selling my house for way more than comparable houses also available on the market, no one is going to want to buy it for that price. And if I'm a buyer and I'm motivated to buy, but there's not a lot of inventory available, I may stretch my budget a little more to make something work. When a project becomes economically feasible in the real estate industry, the term often used is that the project pencils. In market rate rental housing development, projects pencil when rent prices cover operating and construction costs and the associated debt and the interest on that debt. The same is true for sale properties, but without the need to cover ongoing operating costs. So getting more projects to pencil and bringing more properties to market reduces both monthly rents and sale prices. When buyers and renters have more options, they aren't competing to bid up the price of limited choices. When building rental housing that is deemed restricted to be affordable to low-income households, what we finance, rent for the units is capped based on household income. This is the main difference between market rate housing, where rents are set by the market, and affordable housing. And degree of need is often represented by a household's percentage of area median income, or AMI. For example, a household at 30% AMI would be considered very low income. And let me take a moment to explain exactly what affordable currently means in the context of Maryland's housing market, because it's not just the obvious very low income households. Rent and home prices are so high in many areas that a household making 80% of the area median income qualifies for quote unquote affordable housing. But when you look at a household making 80% of AMI, you realize quickly that these are hardworking members of our communities, our first responders, our healthcare professionals, our teachers, and others who are now priced out of those places, and potentially, as shown before, priced out of Maryland entirely. Since rents are capped, affordable housing projects pencil only when public financing reduces project costs to support below market rents. This is made possible through federal, state, and local government subsidies, which reduce the project costs by decreasing the cost of interest to finance the project. Various programs do this through offering below market rate loans and through financing the project through more equity instead of through debt. And typically investors aren't expecting a profit from the project because they've received their financial return through the reduction of their federal tax liability through low income housing tax credits. Often, even with the best affordable housing projects, there's a gap that needs to be filled before an affordable project's financing costs are low enough to pencil. And this is where state government, particularly DHCD, comes in. We award state-funded loans. These are subordinate loans like Rental Housing Works, and sell tax-exempt bonds to investors. We also administer the tax credit itself, the federal low-income housing tax credit, essentially reductions in federal taxes for investors in exchange for equity investments in the affordable housing project. And all of these activities provide resources to projects to fill those financing gaps and bring housing to the finish line for more Maryland families. As you can imagine, as costs increase on a project, that gap grows and the demand on those state resources and even local resources grows. Local governments, depending on their policies that they adopt and their capacity, often their size, can also contribute resources to close the gap, usually in the form of grants or low interest loans or pilots, payment in lieu of tax agreements. You can see that just within the financing arena, there are multiple parties and a level of complexity that unfortunately allows for plenty of room for problems to arise, for progress to slow, and for projects to just go wrong. And in the same case, it's the same case for the entire process and those other three steps in the process. I want to focus on two major sources of those problems and that slowing. And one problem that stymies housing development in Maryland is the regulatory regime that we have established around land use, zoning, and land use practices. Again, this is not necessarily unique to Maryland, but there are some unique characteristics to Maryland. And also, it's critical to note that we want to address these challenges and do it in a way that is competitive and sets Maryland up to perform better than other states. Delegate Ruth, I see you have a hand up. I'm happy to pause for questions, Mr. Chair.
Just okay, we'll get them all at the end of the panel. So
okay.
Hand up and I'll take care of it.
Okay. Yeah, feel free to put hands up and I'll just not stop. If a community needs affordable apartments, and gosh, we need as many as possible, good luck right now in Maryland. Of all the land zoned for residential use in the entirety of Maryland, only 11% is zoned for high or even medium density development. Generally, zoning and land use regulations at the local level encourage the construction of larger, separate homes, the kind of McMansion sprawl that I know everyone complains to you about, and they complain to me about as well. In fact, most current zoning regulations make smaller housing effectively illegal in many communities. And when I say smaller housing, I'm not talking about ADUs. I'm not talking about accessory dwelling units. I'm really talking about re-legalizing our existing neighborhoods and the kind of homes that we used to build and that people still love and demand. The types of homes that in some of our older communities that go for a premium. We need a wide variety of housing options in all sizes, but in many communities, government is explicitly prohibiting less expensive housing options. The second major problem is the permitting process, the process through which we enable a particular project to proceed and ensure that it is aligned to existing law. Permitting processes in Maryland make multi-year investments challenging. They increase equity and debt costs, and regulations that are unclear or are subject to discretionary interpretation that vary from reviewer to reviewer. Lack of simultaneous reviews, all of these things causes timeline delays, and I'll expand on this in just a moment. Lack of regulatory certainty and quote unquote early vesting means projects may need to be redesigned or completely stalled if regulatory processes change midway through the long approval process, which in some jurisdictions in Maryland are averaging 48 months. And we can get into jurisdiction by jurisdiction discussion if we need to. This in particular is often the tactic used at the local level to respond to negative feedback and community opposition to delay or stop a housing project. That's certainly not why all processes are slow, but it is absolutely a tactic that is employed from time to time. Whether it's a new application or the sudden passage of new fees by a town council or county council, a change to a setback requirement, all of these are examples that are currently legal, but are often lethal measures that bring slow death to a project by continually moving the goalposts back. A recent nationwide analysis shows that typical multifamily projects take about 15 months to plan and 12 months to build. In contrast, planning documents from one developer that we've seen reveal needing over 42 months for planning and permitting and 12 months in construction. Just think about that. That's 5 years just to get through the entitlement approval process and start building. So we solve the first problem by improving the availability of land for smaller homes and denser development. Imagine if government made a policy decision that would immediately cut the price of a home by a third for Maryland families. Imagine how many more young families could buy their first home in the state. Imagine how many seniors could stay in the communities that they love and age in place. We could do that in Maryland just by allowing townhomes to be built and sold in all residential areas. That's it. That's a policy that could be adopted tomorrow. Townhomes for sale on the market cost 32% less than a detached single family. Making more land available for smaller homes and denser housing reduces housing costs. Increasing housing density also makes construction costs more efficient because it reduces the land price per housing unit or the price per buildable square foot, again, contributing to overall affordability. I don't even need to get into the fact that it also means government has to spend less on roads, less on pipes, less on sidewalks, and less on maintaining all of those things in the long run. So the second topic we discussed, we must improve permitting processes to promote speed, clarity, and predictability. Time is money, and establishing consistent, clear practices to reduce permitting timelines will ultimately reduce home prices and monthly rents in all of your jurisdictions. In Maryland, state and local governments pass laws related to zoning, land use, etc. When someone wants to build something, various regulatory review agencies evaluate the project for consistency with those laws. If the project passes a review, then the agencies issue permits and hopefully, blessedly, construction can begin. So let's take a look at the regulatory review stage for a typical project. You can see that there are 4 different areas of subjects that need to be assessed by 4 different types of entities. Each of these agencies is usually narrow review for compliance with the specific laws and the specific outcomes that they're responsible for. I'm sure we all know how well disparate government entities do at communicating with each other. The entities and agencies usually vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction with varying timelines, processes, and even jurisdictions that do permitting very well still have room to improve. The cumulative impact is that we're slowing down that production of housing. And those delays further drive up the costs. Academic research has indicated that the overall issuance of building permits is reduced 10% by each additional month of local land use review processes. Delays or lengthy processes in local housing approval timelines are correlated, again, with more expensive housing in the jurisdiction. Reforming Maryland's permitting process to reduce approval timelines by 25% could thus boost housing production by up to a third, while complementing other state policy objectives. It would reduce per project costs, lower soft costs, fewer redesigns, and less negotiating, component costs from delays, land carrying costs, etc. It would create more market capacity. Less time to complete each housing project means professional housing construction staff have the ability to complete a higher volume of projects. And it would make the overall market more desirable. Certainty in permitting processes and the regulatory environment means less development risk, and that means we are a better place to invest in. Government can also play a role in reducing project costs by reducing impact and development fees, reducing property taxes, using pilots, revising the fee payment timeline, or reducing carrying costs during development phase, providing more resources for additional income restricted affordable housing projects. All of this stuff contributes to a possible menu of options to reduce those costs. Government can also reduce barriers for lowering cost construction types. For example, manufactured and modular housing, now allowed by right, thanks to the Housing Expansion Affordability Act that was passed by the General Assembly in 2024, on average is at least 35% less expensive than traditionally built on-site construction. Maryland's regulations, like I mentioned, already make this possible. Further government actions to promote housing development include using publicly owned land, like was included in Governor Moore's Housing Starts Here executive order, reducing regulations that require more expensive construction designs, for example, permitting single stairs, and also reducing parking requirements. And as discussed earlier, increasing regulatory clarity and predictability to reduce debt and equity costs. So, in summary, lack of housing production is the main factor behind surging home prices and monthly rents in Maryland. Lack of housing affordability is driving younger people from Maryland, and it is constricting our state's economic growth. In order for Maryland to win the decade and to put all of its residents on a path to work, wages, and wealth, we've got to commit to building more housing. As always, it is a pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to answering any questions you have.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for that thorough presentation. We will start with Delegate Ruth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually think Delegate Jacobs was ahead of me.
That's all right. I get to decide who asked the first question, so that's you, Delegate Ruth. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Mr. Secretary. Really appreciate your being here as always. So no question we have a housing crisis and that we need more housing. However, when you put things up to the free market, they're going to do whatever they can to maximize profit, which doesn't always produce the results that we want. So first of all, how can we ensure that the types of housing that we want built are what gets built, and as opposed to luxury housing, which will generate more profits? And how do we ensure that if they are building the types of housing we want, that they don't maximize their profits by reducing protections for tenants or protections for the environment?
Delegate, great question. I think the first thing we have to acknowledge is that because of the regulatory environment that we've built, we restrict the production of smaller housing. So government is not enabling the smaller units. Now, what I'm not telling you is that the private market will set the price that they want, but they're going to set a price in a competitive landscape. And so when we're producing less housing, when we're requiring housing to be larger, look, there are lots of other policies that I haven't mentioned here that do add to the cost. We require sprinkler systems. There are requirements with respect to the types of HVAC systems. There are lots of other rules and regulations. I'm not sure that those are the right places to start in reducing those regulatory requirements, but we have to start somewhere. I think size is a great place to start. Allowing again buildings to either be adjacent, in jurisdictions that don't currently allow that, and allowing smaller units is a great way to enable smaller, more affordable product to reach the market. I think one of the things that we've got to note is the McMansions and luxury apartments that get through the permitting process and get built. I mean, I have constituents that say all the time to me, like, that's all I see built. That's true. And part of it is because it's so expensive to get through the process that they have to charge a price point. They have to put their units at a price point on the other end that they're going to be in a luxury bracket. They're going to be in a bracket that isn't affordable to any of us. And so I think we can start with size, and we can start by chipping away at the permitting timelines and the permitting predictability process or unpredictability variable to begin to reduce those costs. I agree with you. There are public policy objectives that should be protected in what we allow to be built in this state. But one of the public policy objectives we have to put on the table as a state priority, I think, is also affordability in housing.
You're on mute, Delegate Ruth. Looks like you're talking.
Mr. Chair, obviously I'm out of practice on Zoom as well. So when you talk about permitting reform, you're not advocating for removing protections for tenants or for the environment in building housing.
No, I'm not. And I really think it's. Think That's okay. That's okay. Sorry, I'm hearing myself twice. Forgive me. I think it's really important to note that if we go back to 2024, that Housing Expansion Affordability Act and the Renters' Rights and Stabilization Act, the Housing Community Development Financing Act, if you think about sort of the philosophy that led to that legislative approach, that policymaking approach, in terms of the request for consideration of the General Assembly that the governor made in that housing package, I think it reveals our thinking, which is that we've got to protect the most vulnerable members of our population, which includes strong renter protections and acknowledging that the housing supply shortage has to be addressed at the same time. There are policies that exist that put those two things in conflict, like rent stabilization, if not designed correctly, but there are lots of other policies that I think can be put into practice simultaneously to protect renters and to protect vulnerable people in general and to produce more housing.
Thank you. I appreciate your addition of if not designed correctly to your comment about rent stabilization. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Delegate Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good to see you, Mayor Secretary.
Thank you,
And,
Mayor Delegate.
I appreciate your honesty in recognizing many of these problems, because certainly there, in my time in Annapolis, there's been layers and layers and layers of requirements and legislation that's really had an accumulative effect on what we're talking about today. And you know, um, that's one of the big problems. You touched on it briefly about the communication between all these different agencies, and just to build something now, you know, to go through the process to get each one of these departments and these agencies to speak to each other to clear up their portion of it is pushing the process of permitting out so far that people are so frustrated that they've just given up on it. The other part is that on affordable housing, by the time you get everything that's required in place before you ever put the first block in the ground, it's put a lot of this out of reach, you know, because of these layers of regulations. And you know, many of this is passed down from the state to the local level. And you know, you hear from the local level, well, this is a requirement that's been handed down to us. So, you know, they're all kind of looking at each other, blaming each other, not communicating with each other. And the downside of all this is that the person who's trying to build something gets frustrated because nothing's moving fast. You know, the layers of bureaucracy, so to speak, is just so expensive that it's caused a lot of this problem, in my opinion, especially over where I am. You know, for years we've always said, could we get all these departments in one building and, like, you know, go down the row and get sediment control to check off, and then go to the next one, go to the health department, they check off. But that seems to always be an obstruction in a lot of this processing of permitting. And it seems to be getting worse instead of better. And I hear from a lot of people, I think permitting right now is as difficult as I've ever seen it over where I am. From MDE's perspective, from the health department's perspective, it's really, really difficult. And we're pushing these projects out way beyond, some in many cases past a year before we can even start building. And I think that's led to a lot of the frustration. It's just layers of stuff. And I appreciate you're recognizing. I've got a whole page of things I wrote down while you were talking of you know, the reality of what we're dealing with. But what are we going to do to fix it is the question. I mean, I'll give you credit. You've recognized most of the problems, but how are we going to streamline this and streamline it, not just state, but down, so it works at the local level? Because, you know, ultimately everybody's in this process, you know, the permitting and whatnot, you know, they all have a role in it, and they're all pointing fingers, and they're all layers on top of each other. But the one that you want to be the one purchasing is the one that gets most frustration and really doesn't want to go any further. I mean, I understand all this stuff. We just got to come up with a solution to streamline it somehow. And I'm just not sure if I'm hearing that part of it.
Sure. Well, Mayor Delegate, let me just say this. I think let me say this really, if I can be really plain about it.
Well, I like it when you shoot from the hip.
I think you just touched on a really fundamental thing that is true, but I don't think often recognized about this topic, which is that whatever your political philosophy, there's an opportunity here for common ground in understanding that there is opportunity to succeed in this state or in any state in this union is really rooted in not being sapped of your resources due to government process, and also not being forced into a situation where you're victimized by a government-created environment that is producing negative externalities for vulnerable people. Those are two things that I think everybody can agree on generally. And I think where housing comes in is that we created a system that is so dysfunctional that the market can't catch up. And when it does, it only benefits people that can afford a really great, really expensive, really huge product. And so we have some power to influence that. And look, I want to acknowledge that's not to suggest that supply chain issues and material costs and labor costs and the things that are beyond maybe one state's policy influence, those aren't real cost influencers. But as was indicated in the comptroller's report, the significant influence of permitting delays and regulatory obstacles that we have induces such a price premium on housing in this state that we are not competitive with our neighbors, and we're not competitive with other states that we're losing young people to. And so I think two things that we need to do is, one, enable the construction of cheaper product, which means lowering the bar on what the size of the minimum size of housing and minimum size of lots around the state. I think that's an important thing. I think there's lots of other regulatory changes that could be considered as well. Again, I brought up single stair reform. I brought up parking minimums. There's lots of things that government does to say, you got to build more stuff. It's going to cost more. And we're not getting a public policy benefit from those things. And then on the permitting process, I'll just say two things. Number one, I've been an urban planner, planning commissioner, mayor, now state housing secretary. There's nobody in these positions who is arguing or suggesting that we need longer, slower processes. So it's not as if we've got people that are arguing for the status quo. It's rather, I think, a concern about are we abandoning certain protections, or are we handing over power to another level of government, or giving away our opportunity to review a project and weigh in? And so those are reasonable considerations. But I think as the Housing Starts Here executive order has started to do for state agencies, what we've also learned is that when you force everybody to do a couple things, for state agencies, the governor has mandated we've got to digitize all our permitting. We have to go to allow third-party permitting, and we have to do simultaneous review of projects, cutting out a whole lot of time. We're cutting a whole lot of nonsense that existed in the permitting process at the state level. Now, again, the state is a smaller state policy, and state permitting steps are a smaller sliver of the overall permitting timeline and cost inducement. But let's chip away at all of it. This is something that another thing that exists in that housing executive order is that for Maryland DHCD, when we finance affordable housing projects, we have to dramatically reduce our time. So you have to break process down into all of its individual steps, and then you have to start cutting and turn a 7-day process into a 5-day process, and turn a 5-day process into a 2-day process. And then you got to map that stuff. We're doing the same thing with Reinvest Baltimore on addressing vacancy in Baltimore City. You have to map that stuff and then watch it, monitor it, refine it till you get it shorter and shorter and shorter. So it's happening for state agencies right now. I know that there are local governments, and some of them are on this call, who are leading on this right now. And we want to incentivize that too with the HUD Pro housing grant that we received. That money will be passed to local governments that are doing innovative work. We want to make sure that they are supported in those processes as well, because I think we can trim a lot of time, trim a lot of fat.
Thank you for the short answer. you touched on the simultaneous review, which I think is very important, but it hasn't found its way over here on the shore yet. I guess what I'm trying to say, is there anything you can do that can reiterate these issues to local governments to say, hey, let's do a simultaneous review instead of this? Because, I hear it all the time about, well, now it's going back to this one for review, and they won't give, that says they got 60 days and they won't look at it until 60 days. And there's enormous frustration there on, how it bounces around from these things. And I don't want to, keep me going too long on this. And the other thing I want to mention before you answer that is this Airbnb influx has had a huge impact also, where people that may have wanted to rent homes have taken the route of Airbnbs rather than for families to rent homes, over here on the shore, especially, which is another component that's added to a shortage on that as well. So I'm going to stop there because there's a lot of people with their hands up.
Just real quick, I'll acknowledge, Airbnb, institutional investors. There are a lot of things that are also influencing factors here. But I think, where we can make the most ground is around permitting and regulatory reform and zoning reform. And then I will just say March is when the executive order goes into full effect, or when the agencies have to have implemented that simultaneous review. So for state agencies, we'll be there by March. The plans were turned in November to the governor. And then we've got a few months to implement. And then as far as that local government coordination, we're going to work ever closer. We have a plan to do regular monthly engagements with all of our housing and planning officials around the state. It's something that we started this summer, saw the benefit of that, and we're going to continue to do regular engagement. It's just we need a direct line of communication on best practices, who's doing it well, who needs help, who needs to learn and perform better. We do the same thing at the state to state level. So I think we can benefit from that at the local level too.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Just for the good of the group, one of our potential early session briefings is with the Maryland Coordinated Permitting Review Council, and particularly the departments that are on that council that we interact most with: DHCD, Department of Transportation, Department of Natural Resources, and so forth. So keep an eye out potentially for that. We will turn it to Delegate Ziegler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. So adequate public facilities ordinances. I think everybody recognizes that when you build more housing, you need more infrastructure to go along with it. But I find Howard County is very frustrating in that, to me, it basically just makes housing slower and more expensive without actually triggering any of the infrastructure that we need. And I wonder if you've seen an APFO law that you think does a great job, or if you've made one up in your head. If so, if you could share it.
I make a lot of things up in my head. Very few of them have to do with housing, but I haven't seen an APFO that I would consider to be perfect. I understand the intent. I think they're not bad to have. I operated without one as a local government official. I worked with most of the municipalities and jurisdictions I worked with on the Eastern Shore didn't have them and don't have them. Admittedly, I haven't had to, slog through them as a developer or as a local elected official. My perception when I've seen them in effect with respect to projects that we're trying to get built that we've financed is that they can be weaponized, right? They can be probably a useful tool. I mean, especially when you think about the intent, like good intent, right? As far as the policy goes, require certain things to exist, certain conditions to exist before you can build something, or require contributions to make it happen. You just have to, have either the flexibility to not weaponize it, or I think, operate in a world where you plan your infrastructure and you accept development maybe separately, and the limited crossovers or connections are fewer and farther between. I think there are some things that are just fundamental. Like you've got to make sure that once connections are made, that you have the water and sewer capacity that you need. Like there are some things that you just can't get past, right? I also think there are others, induced traffic, for example, that are always going to be a concern of anyone when the world is changing around them, because nobody likes traffic, everybody hates traffic, and thus every development looks like more cars on the road to people, and thus every development is a problem and something to be blocked. But the reality is, we build right, we don't see those same inducements of traffic. So I think we've tied infrastructure generally together with development policy, particularly residential development policy through the APFO tool. I think they ought to be done really carefully. We made an attempt at talking about this issue in the Housing Expansion Affordability Act, and kind of limiting the APFO effect. That wasn't successful, of course, but it's something that I think it warrants discussion in the future.
Thank you.
Delegate Guyton.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And this is really an informative meeting today, so I appreciate you gathering us all together. I really agree with what a lot of my colleagues have said, and I appreciate you, Secretary Day, because I felt like you were teasing us a little bit with unspecified solutions to some of these problems. So I think the mayor delegate actually got to the bottom of some of that. So I appreciate the really substantial solutions that you have thought through, obviously, very carefully. I've certainly gotten to, and for thank you to Delegate Ziegler as well, because certainly AFPO has been in the front of my mind for the past year since we had all the rigmarole over the bill last year. And Baltimore County hasn't quite gotten it right yet. And I do want to see it not being used as a weapon, but an agent of planning and change. So my question really was more around the streamlining processes, the permitting processes, and for Delegate Ruth and for the rest of us on here that care about this, without reducing the necessary protections that we fought so very hard. But this has been very personal over the last couple of years because my own son had to move to Georgia to afford it. I have been working very closely with Terry Hickey from Baltimore County, who I don't think is on this call. I was looking for him a moment ago. I haven't seen him. He is absolutely amazing in the work he does, because we've seen so much more housing insecurity in the area and trying to come up with plans to help support those folks. And then maybe more than anything else, our county councilman has been out of pocket for a while. He's been ill and he hasn't been doing quite as much in the area. And so a lot of our mutual constituents are coming to me, including builders, people who are trying to open businesses, people who need help with county permit, right? And I have been amazed at the complications and the delays that they're experiencing, because as everyone here knows, the longer it takes to build something, the more it's going to cost. And it's a real problem when we talk to people, particularly about things that are important to me, which is accessible housing in every form, and also redevelopment of vacant properties, which is an area that I think we can do much more work in. The main reason I'm hearing from builders is that the permitting process is just not worth their time for what they're going to get, and the return of investment just isn't there. So I just want to say bravo to everything that's been said. I'll shift then to a different question for you, since you basically addressed most of this already. What are your ideas on how to deal with, or whether we need to deal with, the effects of institutional investment buyers and sellers in the market here in Maryland? I know in other states, they're really, really taking over and causing problems with not just the price of housing, but also the quality of the housing product that's being presented to people. And that's also a big concern to me. Is there anything that we're considering doing this year or that we can assist with in this area?
Delegate, great question. So I think it's really fascinating to look at where those institutional investors, let's just take BlackRock, for example, and where they're putting their money. Look, I agree that it's a problem. I think we should find ways to protect against it. I think if that includes legislative protections, that those should be considered. I don't know exactly what that looks like. But what I would say is they are targeting markets. And I think Maryland is going to increasingly be a place where they want to put their money. They are targeting markets that are underbuilding because it's going to be an appreciating asset. Where we build less, the product is going to increase in price. And so it's a smart investment for them. So places like when they have their earnings calls, when they have their investor calls, they're explicit about this. They don't hide it at all. They'll say, we're looking at the places that make it difficult to build because those are the places where we can buy up more stuff and it's going to increase in value. So I think one of the best protections that we can have is to help things get to market faster, and help build the housing that, either has been, long delayed or proposed or discussed in the places where we think it should be built. I mean, again, I recognize, we don't want to build everywhere. We got to, number one industry is agriculture. We got great places like beyond the Erdel that we want to protect. Like, we don't want to build in these places, but in the places where we should build, let's help stuff get to market faster. I do think that will address the issue with institutional investors.
Okay, thank you so much. I do know it's taking over some of the other states, and we see more and more of those signs. For those of you who don't know, those signs that say, "We'll buy your house cash, cheap, right now, today." That's who we're talking.
Delegate Sarasa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Secretary. I really appreciate this presentation. I have a different question, but I just wanted to follow up on Delegate Guyton's question. In terms of the concern of corporate investors purchasing, private equity purchasing many of the homes and taking them out of reach for our residents. Is there any thought given to regulating that, to restricting that in some way, rather than just depending on flooding the market and hoping that will keep them out of keep them from buying up our housing stock?
Well, I will say, I don't think we're at risk of flooding the market with housing, since we're, dramatically underbuilding and haven't built even what our
Right.
housing market needs to.
But how are we going to prevent the impact that those private equity firms buying up huge stock of land? I mean, it sounded like your answer to Delegate Guyton depended on us building more. And I'm just not
Yes.
sure I understand why not work to restrict that from
Well,
happening.
Sure. As I acknowledged, I think that's a reasonable policy question to be explored. I think that could be explored, but we also know, I mean, they're not hiding it. By building more, they won't invest here.
If we
They're
more
clear on their investment calls. On their investor calls, they're investing in places that are building less.
Okay, I don't, okay. But I do want to go back to this regulatory certainty issue. Because I do understand, I may not agree with you entirely on just allowing for, smaller housing. But I do understand the concept of that. But when you look at other regulations, I mean, generally speaking, our regulations aren't in place just to restrict development. For the most part, they're to protect our people and to protect our environment. And so I get worried when I hear things like that you brought up, and I don't know if you were suggesting that we remove HVAC and sprinkler regulations. I hope not. But you did keep mentioning single staircase, and single staircase, I mean, having multiple staircases is a safety regulation. So I worry when you start saying that we're starting with housing size, and then looking into other regulations. Like to be clear, I really think this sort of streamlining, and doing, multiple levels of review at the same time, I think that's a fabulous idea. I have concerns that um, when we and I know I'm not changing topics, but I'll go back to that, speed up the process and say, okay, well, what took you 7 days needs to take 5 days, and what needs to take, 5, make it 3 or 2 or whatever, what have you. What that often is on a local level, and I'm sure you know this, and also on the, MDE, et cetera, is a staffing issue. It's if we had more staff, we could get through things faster. So I've talked to reviewers for many, many years. And, I understand why it takes them to the 60 days that Delegate Jacobs was mentioning, because they're just putting out fires. They're taking what they can and getting to it as fast as they can. And if something's due in 60 days, they get to the 60 days and they're like, oh, this one has to be done now. So what are you doing on that part? And then we can go back to the other piece, but to look at increasing that staffing so we can get through a review process faster, and not just speeding up the review so that perhaps they can't get to it. And then the things that protect safety and the environment don't get reviewed.
Yeah, so let me start with the staffing issue. As a both in my role today and as a local government official, when one of the things that we did was restructured city government, merging many departments into one permitting office, having a one-stop shop for infrastructure design and development permitting and development review. And that new Department of Infrastructure and Development it had previously been part of 7 different city agencies in a relatively small place. So you can imagine how complex the experience was to an applicant at the time. And that's still true in most jurisdictions, that there's not that kind of consolidated entity, though there are others that have consolidated. So what I would say is, I think in every single step of our efforts there and even now to streamline process and to reduce timelines, resource allocation is a part of the conversation. It has to be. Systems is a part of the conversation. It has to be, which, by the way, not cheap either, right? Buying the right systems and then training your people on it takes time and money too. So I think Baltimore City has recently had a very public experience with the learning curve of getting that right, going through a tough period and getting that right ultimately. That's been a very public process, but lots of smaller jurisdictions experience the very same pain trying to implement a new technology. But the third is really process design, and the fourth, I think, is regulatory clarity and simplicity. I think you can design your laws such that there is a more predictable pathway to an approval, right? And I think that's one of the expectations and one of the requests here. As far as getting the staff in place, that's one of the things this HUD Pro grant is going to be used for. We're going to pay these local jurisdictions with the HUD Pro housing grant to assist them in the development of regulations and the improvement of their permitting processes, et cetera, really ultimately to seed innovation at the local level. That's really what that funding is about.
Okay, great. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No.
I just wanted to follow up on the other end of the regulatory. Why not regulate the sort of the private equity market, but also why not do one of the things that we know is part of the formula to get more affordable housing and actually require affordable units? And again, not depending on the sort of getting to a point where our supply is high enough so that based on your numbers of 100,000, we're not going to get to a place where our supply meets our demand soon enough to actually bring prices down. So why not require, say, for example, in every development of more than 1 or 2 homes, for example, you have to have a certain percentage affordable?
Well, because inclusionary zoning really works against broad affordability. It produces a small number of units. It drives up the cost for the other units, and it just doesn't solve the problem. So it doesn't work. That's why. I mean, it's a great theoretical concept. It just doesn't work.
Based on what? I mean, I'm trying to understand that it actually produces units, whereas we know that building more doesn't necessarily produce affordability. Otherwise, New York City would be the cheapest city in the world, as dense as it is. But where's that evidence that requiring a certain percentage of affordable housing drives the price up for affordable units?
And really all of the academic research on this topic. New York City density itself doesn't produce affordability, right? Exceeding or meeting demand with supply is what produces affordability. New York City would have to build a whole lot more housing if it wanted to catch up to demand. But places like Austin, Texas, where they've built sufficient supply to catch up, in states like Florida and Texas that are now producing housing much faster than they were, they're beating us at the game. They're recognizing they can produce more affordable units faster. Now, as I indicated at the beginning, I think what most people are familiar with what we do is we finance income restricted units. I think we have to produce lots of those units. I want to produce lots more of those units. I want to find lots of ways to produce those units. I'd love to have more dollars in rental housing works to do just that. That's a piece of the puzzle because the market will never produce the lowest income units. We have to produce those units with government subsidy. It's the only way. That being said, I think if we simultaneously address the permitting and regulatory reforms necessary, we can do both. And they don't have a deleterious effect on one another. We can do both of those things. So I think what you're saying about producing those affordable units is absolutely 100% part of the equation. Those in capital A affordable income restricted units, 100% part of the equation. And also, and for the benefit of those units not costing $1 million a piece, we need permitting and regulatory reform as well. Like we can and should produce those units at a lower cost than we produce them today, and faster. We go to ribbon cuttings. We produce affordable housing units, and frankly, when it takes 4 years to do it or 5 years to do it, and it costs $800,000-$900,000 per unit to do it, it doesn't feel as good as it should. So I think for the benefit of the whole conversation, both of the things that we're talking about here can be true. And to your point about private equity investment, like I said, I still think that's a reasonable policy objective to say we're going to simply regulate on that issue. I don't know what the second and third order effects are, but I know how we can help keep them out now. So maybe both of those things should be explored as well.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Secretary, I know you've been out of office a while, but ribbon cuttings always feel good. Delegate Naraki?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's great to see you. It's great to see everyone. Mr. Secretary, I've got maybe a slightly different perspective than some of my colleagues on this. We agree on a lot, but my district is maybe a little bit different than some others. In the past less than a decade, we've had 3,000 units come on in the Middle River area, and we've got another 6,000 or so coming on in a very defined area. So we are absolutely experiencing a lot of development, which is good. It's helping with the problem, but we are experiencing a lot of the pain that occurs with 9,000 new units coming into a defined area. So my first question is, how do we spread that love out, right? It's great to build houses, but I don't think that any one community should have to bear the burden of all the housing in a particular county. This is a Baltimore County question, but I'm sure there may be others around the state that are experiencing something like this as well. And again, it's not that I'm anti-housing or anti-development, but there are real challenges when you come with building that level of housing in a particular area quickly. And I think if you spread it out a little bit, you might not have one community with some of the challenges that we're experiencing, where everybody kind of experiences some of that then at that point.
Delegate, I think you're entirely right. I think there are likely other jurisdictions on this call who would attest to the same feeling, and I think we could probably together name a half a dozen or so around the state that have experienced explosive growth in recent years and are probably looking to throttle that speed. I have admittedly, when I look at this as a statewide problem, been looking to relieve the pressure and the backlog through policy solutions. But I also think fundamentally, good planning and then sticking to those plans can produce more housing in the jurisdictions that haven't been producing it, and maybe taper off some of the housing construction and development that we've seen in the jurisdictions that have to catch up in terms of infrastructure development. So I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing to say, we need a balancing of this. I think the way we get there is those jurisdictions that have not been able to produce the housing that maybe they would like, or that would help them provide some price relief. We help them get better at their permitting and approval. It's not that we need anybody to shut the doors. I think if we provide relief by saying, other jurisdictions can accept that, a lot of these markets are interconnected. Middle River is not isolated, right? So there are other jurisdictions nearby where housing development could go, and that pressure could provide some relief. But when the rest of the region is underproducing, and you're seeing lots of housing development in Middle River, you're going to continue to see that. And obviously, there's some natural demand and supply response, but I think pretty clearly this is where the better planning we do on the front end. This speaks also to this issue of early vesting. The better planning and community engagement we do on the front end, the less we need to, question whether or not something should have been approved on the later end, because it will have been in compliance with our vision. So I think it's a great question. It's one that I don't hear much about because there aren't that many jurisdictions building a lot of housing. But I think it's a perfectly reasonable one. And it's one we can continue to stay engaged on.
Okay, I would love to engage with you a little bit more about that, because I do think that maybe my circumstance is somewhat unique to other, not completely unique. I know that but even in Baltimore County, it's a somewhat unique circumstance because a lot of the growth in the county is channeled into my area of the county, whereas the county as a whole has a net population loss. Not in this area of the county, but the county as a whole has had a net population loss. I do have one other sort of question that is a follow-up to some of the other things that you've been talking about. And I love the idea of simultaneous review. I think that's great. One of the things that I can say that I know that not only housing developers, but businesses in general in Baltimore County have experienced, and it's probably not just Baltimore County, but it's about 7 different departments that have to sign off on something in Baltimore County. What many will tell me is that when they get, say they get to department number 6 or number 7, even though all the others have already approved, that last department or two says something's wrong here. And of course, everyone should be doing due diligence. They then have to get back in the beginning of the line and go through all those departments again. I feel like there is a tremendous efficiency loss there. What are your thoughts about that? How can we? I mean, I think that alone, if we could solve that would move the ball a lot forward with simultaneous review and all these other things. But if they just didn't have to get back to the beginning of the line, if they could just start at number 6 and make their way to number 7, then or whatever place that they're at. What are your thoughts on that, and what can we do about a circumstance like that?
That is a failure of government, right? I mean, we put people in a position where one reviewer in one agency can contradict another, and then you're left. Even, by the way, even multiple reviewers within the same agency. We've seen some of the examples from specific projects that we've reviewed where there's contradiction between one reviewer and another on different issues coming from different parts of the same department, same state department, and ultimately we'll have a different vision of what the law says or what regulation says about a particular part of the plan or issue. So what I can tell you is that what we put into place in March, the improved process for the state agencies that have regulatory responsibility. It's my hope that we're able to set a vision of what multi-agency, collaborative, simultaneous review looks like, which requires reviewers getting together at the table together. It requires them having a shared view and multiple points, at least beginning and end, multiple points where you have reviewers from different agencies literally looking at the project at the same time. And so what I'm hopeful is that we'll be able to demonstrate from a state level what that looks like. From a local level, I think we're looking for great examples of that kind of innovation and leadership at the local level that we can award support to, either through the Housing Leadership Awards or the HUD Pro Housing Grant. So financial support, leadership awards, and ultimately, helping them with additional funding from the state when they demonstrate these great examples is exactly where we want to head. So we'll sit down and talk to county governments and municipal governments about their ideas, and if they want, to workshop these thoughts and look at kind of what the state's doing, we're happy to do that as well. I think these regular engagements with housing and planning departments that the state's going to be doing moving forward will also help.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Secretary.
Last question for this panel will be Delegate Lehman.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and Secretary Day. Thank you for the continuing conversation on this really important issue, and thanks for the work by you and your team. So I have a sort of 30,000 foot level kind of question about the definition of affordability tied to AMI, 80% AMI, being, I guess, low income, and 50% very low income, 30% extremely low income. And wondering about, where is there room? Because I kept hearing you talk about 80% for the people at, say, between 80 and 50, where it goes to that next, definition of being very low income versus low, because I don't hear mention of that. And then the other part of that is, I think a bigger question: how do we marry that affordability concept tied to those higher levels of AMI to the old-fashioned, voucher system for much lower income folks that everyone that's ever worked, even briefly in housing, knows that those voucher programs have wait lists of 8 to 10 years. Given that these are both subsidies we're talking about, whether it's, affordable housing tied to, higher tiers of AMI versus vouchers for lower income folks, like we need to do, better all the way around. Why aren't we addressing that whole big picture and that whole range of income simultaneously?
Lots of good questions in there. I think number one, let me just say that it's going to be tough to get the federal government to create new vouchers anytime soon. So we have that restriction on kind of demand side influence, that restriction on tools for demand side influence. The General Assembly wisely.
But Mr. Secretary, really briefly, and this, we certainly cannot blame that. We can blame a lot on the Trump administration. That is not one thing. As long as I've been, working in housing policy for more than 20 years, there is a just grossly inadequate investment in vouchers. And those wait lists have been 8 to 10 years long, at least in my county, for as long as anyone can remember.
I don't think it has anything to do with the Trump administration. I think every federal administration has failed to produce more housing vouchers that respond to actual demand. So my point is, we're not anytime soon going to see a change in number of federal housing vouchers. What I was going to say is that this state General Assembly wisely created a state housing voucher program and the community schools program. I think that kind of state level leadership is exactly what we need. It's not going to get us very far. We don't have a lot of money in that program, but I think it's the kind of work that needs to be done. I think even locally created vouchers, having some experience with that is a great tool. But demand side solutions don't solve the housing crisis. They simply don't, and they're never going to. They're important. They're part of the equation. We'll never get there without them. We'll never house everyone without those demand side solutions, but they're not going to unilaterally solve the housing crisis. We have to address supply. We have, the housing crisis matches month for month our failure to build. The housing crisis began in December 2008, and it has mapped to that same trajectory. It's not as if it started somewhere else, right? So I think we have to acknowledge that if we fail to address the supply issue, and if we fail to address our role in the supply issue, it's not the only influencing factor, but if we fail to address our role on the regulatory, permitting, zoning side of the equation, we're not going to get out of this thing. So I think it's reasonable to address both. As far as affordability, deeply affordable housing with state investment and using the low-income housing tax credit is also critical at the 30%, 50%, 60%, and up to 80% AMI levels is super critical. We need it. My department is going to be working over the coming months to propose new ways to deploying those resources. Because the bottom line is this: we have built a model, right, that puts our affordable housing owners and developers in an untenable position, and put the viability of these programs, like rental housing works, in a position that's untenable. And we can do better. And there are other states that are just starting to figure this out. And Maryland is going to be among the leaders on this issue. But Massachusetts, Illinois, Michigan, and New York are the first 4 states to have launched housing accelerator funds that do a better job of producing simultaneously, to Delegate Terras's point, simultaneously income restricted and market rate units co-located. So you're also not concentrating poverty, which I think is another thing that as a state we ought to be thinking about, what our future investment in affordable housing does to people and their trajectory in life. So we don't want to concentrate poverty. So we want to produce both. I think we can do that. It's going to take a little time, and it's going to take a public conversation around this. But I really think that's where we have a ton of potential to address the point that you're making about the deeply affordable product that's needed, and the point that I'm making that we have to simultaneously open up supply. I think both of those things are true and can happen together.
Well, I just would say I thank you for all of that. That's good to hear you addressing the, 60, 50, 30% AMI population. I couldn't agree more that I think the ideal, type of development going forward is mixed on income development. And I certainly get your point about supply and demand. I just was concerned that I kept hearing 80%, 80%, 80% without addressing, all the other needs out there. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Delegate Lehman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. As you said, you will be with us many, many, many more times between now and 4 months from now. So we look forward to further engagement. We'll turn to our second panel, which is a local government panel. We have Kimberly Rubens from City of Baltimore, Kelly Camino from Howard County, and Megan Cook from the town of Easton. I know she may also be joined by her town manager. I'll just ask each of you to go one after the other, and then we will take questions at the end of the panel. So Ms. Rubens, please go ahead when you're ready.
Great, thank you. Okay, thank you, Chair Corman and Vice Chair Boyce, and distinguished members of the committee for the opportunity today to present on residential development in Baltimore City. My name is Kimberly Rubens. I am filling in for Commissioner Alice Kennedy, who unfortunately could not be here today. She sends her regrets. I am the Chief of Policy and Research for the Baltimore City Department of Housing and Community Development. I have been in this role for approximately 4 years, been with the city for 7. I oversee all strategic planning for Baltimore City's housing work at the intersection of policy and politics. I manage 2 teams, the research and analytics team. So maybe, and hopefully many of you on this call have used CodeMap, and our legislative affairs team. I am going to be talking about 3 things as it relates to residential development in Baltimore City today, both the challenge and the vision of our vacant property inventory, the vacant reduction priority geographies, of which we are working in lockstep with my state partner, primarily Secretary Day and his team, as well as walk you through what residential development looks like through the lens of whole block planning. All right, so first, the challenge and the vision. So we are very proud that Baltimore is having a renaissance since 2023, 5.9% growth in our GDP, 8th highest among our nation's largest counties. We have a 2.1% unemployment rate, and truly this is one of the things that Mayor Scott and everyone in Baltimore City is most proud of, a nearly 50% reduction in homicides from end of year 2022 through today, as well as another big success, which we couldn't have done without our state partners, which was 11 weeks to fully reopen the Port of Baltimore after the tragic Key Bridge collapse. Despite that, Baltimore has a history of redlining, blockbusting, population loss, and disinvestment, which makes residential development expensive in many neighborhood housing markets, and very challenging. So what you're seeing here on the screen is what we call our housing market typology. That is on the left. It is a typology that is created by the Reinvestment Fund. We partner with them to create this typology every 3 years. We are gearing up for the 2026 typology. And what this does is looks at a series of variables to assign a letter category to neighborhoods based on a host of variables, everything from housing price to days on market to type of housing stock, vacant land, and vacant property. And then what you're seeing on the right-hand side are concentrations of VBN density. So VBN stands for Vacant Building Notice, which is our official count for vacant buildings in the city of Baltimore. And you'll notice that some of our most distressed neighborhoods, which are in purple or the indigo color, mirror quite closely with where we have our highest concentration of vacants. This is also compounded by the fact that most vacants in Baltimore City are privately held. So as of November of this year, we have 12,317 vacant buildings registered in Baltimore City. This is a legal definition. I'm happy to go into more detail on this, but I know I am limited on time, and I'm sure there will be questions. While only 7.3% of the total VBN stock is actually owned by the city, which means we have only site control of 968 vacant properties across the city. So now I'd like to transition into what we refer to as our vacant reduction priority geographies. These are the geographies that we are partnering with the state as part of Reinvest Baltimore or Reframe Baltimore, depending on who you ask. This makes up 42 neighborhoods, including our impact investment areas announced in 2019, the neighborhoods you see in the middle column on this screen, as well as certain sections of neighborhoods in the third column, as well as WNADA. So that's the West North Avenue Development Authority, a state quasi-agency that was established, I believe, in legislation back in 2023 that includes 16 neighborhoods, some of which overlap with our West Impact Investment Area. And so the purpose of focusing on these vacant reduction priority geographies, or VRPGs, is to apply our whole block strategy, which I will speak about momentarily, to address the vacants issue in these neighborhoods, as well as restart and reinvigorate the markets that are currently not functioning. So for example, in our Broadway East Impact Investment Area, last time I checked, the average assessed value of a homeowner occupied property is around $30,000. So we're talking about severely depressed and undervalued properties in the city of Baltimore. These were the selection criteria for selecting our VRPGs. And so what you see on the right-hand side is the location, which overlays well with the clustering of all of our vacants. Some key information about moving from theory to implementation in working in our VRPGs is not just where vacants are, but also that we are adjacent to neighborhoods of strength. There's strong community engagement, and that there are existing community assets. So that could be 21st century schools, rec centers, or development projects that are underway. So to operationalize this plan, we have two very clear key tenets. It's to reduce the vacant building count, eliminate vacant buildings over 15 years, and to produce whole block outcomes. Whole block outcomes means that we are stabilizing every single property on that block as we are moving through each block in each neighborhood. So it's not just addressing the vacant properties and the vacant lots on that block, but also making sure that homeowners who are what we call our legacy residents are receiving the home repair grant services that they need, the deed, the estate planning services that they need, and make sure that we are focusing just as much on vacancy prevention as we are on vacancy remediation. This plan is possible because unlike a lot of large cities across the country, Baltimore City is what we call a full stack development agency. So we are able to do all of the activities that you see here. It's all 13 things. So everything from acquisition, disposition, project finance and lending to code enforcement, all the way down to our HUD formula grant administration. We are the 7th largest HUD formula grant entitlement in the country. So this year we will receive around $20 million in CDBG entitlement grants. Our work is based not just on the conditions of the neighborhood, but also looking at data. And we are very proud of the research and analytics team at our agency. And so we have, for example, in Broadway East, which is the map on the right, our fiscal 25 priorities, we have 28 priority blocks. And on those 28 priority blocks, there are 113 VBNs that we're targeting, 155 lots, some highlighted investments, as well as the leading market conditions. So as I said, median sales price is about $30,000. The home ownership rate is quite low. Population has also been decreasing since 2010. And so these are all of the leading indicators that through targeted investment on our priority blocks, we want to see change in the next 5 to 10 years. Now, I would like to take some time to walk through how we approach residential development using the whole block strategy and property level planning through our GIS tools, as well as our city-state partnership. So first, really important to make sure that we are all on the same page about how a whole block is defined. So for those that might remember the project core years, a block was defined as just half of a block face, but that's not how a resident experiences a block. So it's 2 sides of a street facing each other from corner to corner. And so now I'm going to walk through the 2600 block of Loyola Northway, which is what this block looked like in January of 2020. There were 18 VBNs and 4 owner-occupied properties. What you're also seeing here is a screen grab of CodeMap. There are 2 versions of CodeMap, one that is public-facing and one that is internal to DHCD, which has administrative data, including all of our planning data that we do not share with the public for reasons primarily related to speculators. Excuse me, calling back to what Secretary Day mentioned earlier about how BlackRock is very excited to come into Maryland and scoop up lots of properties. So looking at the 26 block of Loyola Northway, as I mentioned earlier, every single property gets assigned a strategy, from acquisition to site assembly to demolition to disposition to monitoring that property for code enforcement activities. And then you can see here, despite the fact that it is a very time intensive and a very labor intensive process from both a capital and operational perspective, what you're seeing on the right-hand side of the screen are before and after. So the picture on the right-hand side is what the properties look like before, and then on the left-hand side are the properties after. And so that's $420,000 of funding from Baltimore DHCD for acquisition and stabilization, $300,000 from our partners at state DHCD for demolition, stabilization, developer subsidy, and buyer subsidy. And then and then by making this around $720,000 investment, we were able to leverage over $1 million in private investment. This work is expensive. It costs around $250,000 per property to rehab. The current price that we're getting from developers, depending on the size and scope of the project, is $80 to $150 per square foot. And then the resale price could be anywhere from $290,000 to $350,000, depending on the market conditions. And the whole block strategy that I've just described on the 2600 block of Loyola Northway is part of a historic city-state $3 billion capital stack that pulls multiple financing sources to build in residential neighborhoods. So to call back to the map that I showed earlier, we are investing in neighborhoods outside of the downtown core. And right now we have approximately 1.5 billion in committed funds for this 15-year plan to eliminate vacants. And I would like to take a minute to really thank Secretary Day and our partners at the state and our delegation partners for their commitment to Reinvest Baltimore funds, formerly known as Project Core and Bernie, because we would not be able to be doing this work without those funds. And then to take that $3 billion, this is what we plan to do with that money. So that money will be spread across these activities and across these neighborhoods. So the activities are demolition, acquisition, stabilization, live work grants, which is similar to a developer incentive, home buyer down payment grants, which will write down the mortgage affordability, home repair grants to protect our legacy residents, and then infrastructure. Infrastructure is a key piece of investment that needs to be made, primarily in street repair, sidewalk repair, doing things like moving utility lines from the back to the front of property. That was a big thing to get the 800 block of Edmondson activated in the Upton neighborhood. And all of this gets us to about $3.1 billion over the 15-year life cycle of the plan. These are some property outcomes that we have seen since January 1st of 2024. The data that you're seeing here on the right-hand side is cumulative. And one of the things that we are most proud of is since Mayor Scott has taken office, we have seen a 22% drop in the number of vacant buildings in Baltimore City. Again, I want to emphasize a 22% drop since 2020 in the number of vacant properties in Baltimore City. Calling back to a delegate who mentioned earlier about the need for streamlining permits, we recently launched a new permit system in Baltimore City, not without its hiccups. We are very aware that there are challenges both with the system itself, with our own processes, but we have launched, if you use this QR code, a link to a new permits dashboard, so you can get all sorts of information that will update in real time about where a permit is specifically, as well as cumulative information about the city's progress to date in issuing permits since the launch of the system in February of this year. We have also done modeling on what a $3 billion investment would look like over time. And we find that by year 2053, this investment more than pays for itself. And this was done through an independent analysis conducted by PFM, a firm out of Philadelphia. And finally, I have been asked to speak about scaling and coordination opportunities. So these are the three buckets in which we as a city look at how to amplify this work and what we need in order to keep this momentum going. When it comes to people and health, we definitely need support from partners on home repair grants, homeownership coaching, estate planning, workforce development to be able to get more, to rehab more properties quickly and get more back online, as well as technical assistance grants. Financial products. Since 2010, the financial markets have not necessarily kept up, especially to be able to be flexible enough to work with our small developers. And so the first thing that we're looking at right now are how do we get more flexible and cheaper capital into the hands of our small developers in order to make sure that we're doing this work in an equitable way. So it's not just big construction companies coming in to rehab these vacants. And then finally, in terms of infrastructure, it's not just about repairing sidewalks, repairing roads. We need to reactivate vacant lots. We need to improve our tree canopy, more green space, pedestrian lighting, as well as invest in solar and electrification. So I know I just ran through a lot of information in quite a short amount of time. I think I have some time for questions, and I will expand on the side here so I can start taking questions.
So
And
actually,
happy to go back to slides.
Yeah, we'll get to questions after we hear from the other local government reps, if that's all
Okay,
right.
great.
So
Of course. So I'll stop
this gives
sharing
me
my
a chance
screen.
to get
Thank you for the
Kelly's-
opportunity to present.
Absolutely. Thanks for filling in. This gives me a chance to get Kelly Cimino's name closer to right from Howard County. So please go ahead.
That's okay. You are not the first. Good afternoon, everyone. So let's see if I can get my screen up. There we go. And get it to, okay. Are you seeing that?
Yep, we can see it.
Great. Okay.
It's
So
not
good
in
afternoon.
it's not in presentation mode if that matters to you, but we can still see the slides.
Okay, I'm going to keep going because I don't want to take up your time. Good afternoon, everyone. As the chairman said, I am Kelly Cimino. I'm the director of housing for Howard County. I've been here. I'm getting ready to start my 10th year. So very excited about that. I'm going to contradict something Secretary Day says. I hope he still thinks we're friends, but I'll go ahead and go forward. So thank you for the opportunity to present to the committee. In 2023, October 2023, Howard County finished our 20-year HOCO by design, our next general plan. This general plan attacks many of the issues that we have already discussed today, but there are three basic ones here in Howard County: affordability, lack of land for development, and of course, lack of supply. We are a small county, and we also have something called the public service area, where about half of our county is not served by public water and sewer. So those are some constraints that we face. However, in our plan, we did discuss some of the things that we can do to address that, and that is missing middle housing and accessory dwelling units. And I know our friends in Montgomery County have been very successful with accessory dwelling units. We also are an aging county, so we are looking for housing that meets age-friendly and multi-generational needs. We are also talking about workforce housing. And this is where I'll differ with the secretary. We do have moderate income housing unit program here in Howard County, our inclusionary zoning program. And while it may make our for sale product a little more expensive, we are very happy to report that 850 households rent an apartment in Howard County through the moderate income housing unit program, and a 2-bedroom apartment rents for about $1,903 versus $3,000 and $4,000 a month. So to those 850 families, this is a very important program. Regarding our moderate income housing unit for sale program, we have about 600 homeowners that are taking advantage of that program. Those units are affordable in perpetuity. That means we sell them over and over again as families move on to other moderate income families. And our average sale price last year was $302,000. And the family that was able to buy that, the average income was $84,000 a year. Compared to our market rate price in Howard County of almost $600,000, our moderate income housing program is making a difference for our families that work here in the county. Another component of the HOCO by design general plan talks about infrastructure and growth, and there was conversation in previous speakers about the adequate public facilities ordinance, about low-income housing tax credits, about payment in lieu of taxes. We are using all of those tools. We are also using the county's Housing Opportunities Trust Fund to help fill gaps for new rental housing. Over the last 3 years, we have worked with Enterprise Community Development. They are redeveloping 5 projects in downtown Columbia. they will take their projects from 300 units to 600 units by getting pilots, by approving pilots, by approving county funding, by receiving tax credits. We are preserving existing affordable units and adding new affordable units. Also, those units are now fully accessible, fully visitable. They are in an amenity-rich area with very good schools. So all of those things are combining to help us be able to provide affordable housing for people who were already living here in Howard County and for people who would like to move here. And finally, we are looking at how do we support jobs and workforce housing. And one of the ways that we're doing that is we have a few transit-oriented designs zoning districts, which means they're near the MARC station or near transit. And there was a bill earlier this year that provides a waiver of the adequate public facilities ordinance for a project to move forward in a transit-oriented zoning district if they provide a greater level of affordability. And that greater level of affordability is 15% of the units would be rented to households of moderate income. And that for a 60% family of four is $84,000 a year. But it requires them to add 5% of the units to be rented to disability income housing units or families that receive disability income. And that is at a 30% AMI. And that means a one-person household of $29,000 would rent an apartment for around $750 in a transit-oriented design zoning district because of this council bill. So this is a way that we are adding deeper affordability, we are adding more connectivity, and we are expanding our inclusionary zoning program to address the lack of affordability here in Howard County. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We can turn to the town of Easton.
You share my. Can you see my screen?
We can.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, and thank you, Chairman Corman and Secretary Day, for the opportunity to be here today to talk about the challenges of affordable housing in Easton. It isn't just an issue for Maryland's larger cities and counties. Smaller towns and rural communities are feeling the same pressures, and in many cases, those pressures are growing faster than our resources to respond to them. In Easton, we've identified affordable housing as one of our most significant challenges, just as so many municipalities and counties across the country have, and we're not treating it as an abstract issue. We've been focused on real, actionable steps that match the scale of the need and fit the character of our town. Easton has, whoops, didn't switch the screen. For some reason, the next slides are not going up. Oops, there we go. Easton is the largest town in Talbot County and nearly half the county's population. And our housing data makes the challenge very clear. Today, the median home value in Easton is about $451,000. Our area median income is $100,000, which means the typical family can afford a home priced around $304,000. That's a gap of almost $150,000, and most families simply can't bridge that. A few options that the town of Easton is exploring to close that gap are creative incentives to help developers build more affordable units, offset development costs, and update our zoning and land use policies to support the types of homes at the level and densities our community actually needs, and to streamline our permitting process when possible. Over the last year and a half, our Affordable Housing Task Force has taken a deep dive into these options and asked further questions. Recently, they delivered a final report outlining the 5 pillars a town can adopt, including a public-private pilot project on publicly owned land, zoning and policy reforms, pilot agreements, and an inclusionary zoning ordinance. These tools can make more attainable housing possible. And at the heart of the work is the reality that when our essential workers or even our town staff can't afford to live in the community they serve, it affects our schools, our businesses, and the overall health of our town. A vibrant Easton depends on a diverse and inclusive community, and that includes diversity in income and housing options. Easton is a beautiful historic town with limited space for growth, Because of that, we work carefully to balance higher density housing with neighborhood concerns while still recognizing the urgency of our affordable housing challenge. But small towns face structural barriers that make it harder to respond quickly, and that's an important part of today's conversation. Because under state law, when municipalities annex land, we gain planning and zoning authority. However, for the first 5 years, we cannot approve substantially different land use or densities more than 50% higher than what the county previously allowed unless the county grants a waiver. In practice, that gives the county veto power over any significant zoning changes during that period, even if it's consistent with our own comprehensive plan. This matters because affordable and workforce housing often depends on higher density or different housing types. If the county doesn't approve the waiver, projects can be stalled for 5 years, delays that frequently make them financially unviable. On top of that, counties also control the growth tier classifications. A town cannot reclassify annexed land to Tier 1 unless the area is already designated for public sewer service in the county water and sewer plan, and only the county can amend that plan. So between the 5-year restriction and the county's control over water, sewer, and growth tiers, counties retain a significant leverage over how and when a town can move forward. For towns like Easton, it can slow down projects that fit our comprehensive plan and meet real needs in our community. And Easton is committed to doing our part. We understand our community, we understand the urgency, and we've identified the tools and policies that can make a meaningful difference. But we also want to be honest about the hurdles, even when we have public support, even when we have a partner to build it, and even when a project fits our vision and our values. Our ability to move forward can depend entirely on county decisions. So my ask today is simple as you're considering things, is that as the state continues shaping a housing strategy for Maryland, we hope you'll keep in mind the constraints municipalities are working under. And we ask that you explore ways to support more flexibility and stronger partnerships between towns and counties. Towns are closest to their needs and best positioned to shape responsible, community-driven growth. Clearer pathways for collaboration and fewer bottlenecks that delay viable projects would help municipalities like Easton move more quickly toward Maryland's shared goals of increasing affordable and attainable housing.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Delegate Ruth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the panelists. I have 2 questions for Kimberly. So the first one is about the whole block strategy, which I think is brilliant. And the committee saw when we visited Johnston Square, we saw how it was working there, developing whole blocks at a time in conjunction with community amenities. So this is really just a question about how it works, because on one of your slides, there was a picture of a block and it had, and maybe you said this and I missed it, but it had private sale to developer in progress as one of the little bubbles. And so with Johnston Square, if I'm not mistaken, it's one developer doing everything. And if you have multiple developers, how does that work in terms of creating a unified strategy for the block?
That's a great question. I'm hearing an echo.
Oh, that's me. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Delegate Ruth, if you can mute.
Thank you. Great question. Okay, so Johnston Square, they're the sole developer for Johnston Square. So we will dispose of all properties to Rebuild Metro, the development arm of choice for the Johnston Square Community Association. But in other neighborhoods, it's about creating a network of developers based on the desires of community leaders. So there was also an earlier slide about how we make decisions for blocks, and it's always in partnership with community leaders, CDCs, community members. And so, for example, one of the blocks that I mentioned, the 800 blocks of Harlem and Edmondson, we did an RFP. At this point, it was a while ago because we didn't have the same access to capital, but the selected developer, again, with community leaders on the RFP selection committee, was Dean Harrison. And so he is the developer of choice there. But we also work with Black Women Build in what's called Upton is part of the West Impact Investment Area. Parity Homes is working in there, and a number of other developers. And so it definitely will make the process slower. Like I'm not going to sit here and lie and say that having more developers speeds things up or can always create like necessarily the same types of efficiencies that you might see in Johnson Square, but having community voices at the center of how neighborhoods are being revitalized is critical. So something else based on our experiences, and we've been testing this since 2010. We have 4 proof of concept neighborhoods: Greenmount West, Barclay, Reservoir Hill, and Johnson Square to a certain extent. And based on all of our learnings and experiences over the years, we thought it would be helpful to create what we called an RFI, so a request for information in Broadway East and East Baltimore Midway. And that was a request for information for qualified developers. And so that way they'd be pre-vetted, so that way as we were acquiring properties, we could quickly dispose of them. And again, when I say dispose, I mean sell them to the developer to rehab them quickly. So we're not running into roadblocks, as it were, to get that vacant to a use and occupancy permit. Does that answer your question?
That's helpful. Yes. Thank you so much. I have one other question on a different topic.
Of course, please.
Can you talk about, and I think Baltimore is using some tax strategies to incentivize property owners who own like vacants and are not doing anything with them to either sell or develop them?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Okay, so we have 2 unique ways in which we're using foreclosure, the tax sale foreclosure system, to expedite the rehabilitation and the revitalization of our neighborhoods. The first is in rem tax sale foreclosure. And that, again, couldn't be done without our partners at the state. Very grateful to the state enabling legislation. And so what that allows us to do is we've created a separate docket with Judge Carrion. And as long as the liens on a property, so that could be water bills, it's primarily property taxes typically, exceed the value of that vacant, we are able to acquire that property on an expedited timeline without violating the due process of the property owner. And when I say expedited, I mean from the time we file a case to judgment in favor of the city, 4 months for a lot of properties. And that was one of the data points that I shared. I think we've acquired to date over 1,000 properties. Close to, no, I think we have 999 underway. We've acquired over 500 properties using the in-rem foreclosure process. And then starting in fiscal 27, so July 1 of next year, we will be taxing vacant properties at a different rate. It is 3 times the normal property tax rate of a city property. It won't push many properties into the in-rem foreclosure pipeline, but it will make it less appealing for speculators, for LLCs to hold on to properties, because one way in which speculators do hold on to properties is if a property is only assessed at $1,000, $2,000, and even though Baltimore City does have the highest property tax rate in the state, if it's 3 times that, it's still much less appealing than not.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome. And I'll just, while I'm, unmuted in here, again, in partnership with State DHCD, we've created an excellent dashboard. It's called the BVRC dashboard. It's on the Reinvest Baltimore website. You can track our progress in real time and see it literally up to the minute. Information on number of in-rem foreclosure filings completed, in progress, dispositions completed, in progress, literally every single activity that City DHCD is undertaking is all publicly available. It's linked in the presentation, and I'd be happy to share it with my counterparts on the ENT committee to make sure it gets distributed to the delegation. It would definitely be useful and helpful as it's maintained by my team and very accurate.
Great. Let's turn to Daryl, get Lehman.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And I am no longer driving, you'll be happy to know. So I'm still in my car, but I'm not driving. Thank you to the local jurisdictions for your presentations and your creativity and your resourcefulness. I'm so impressed by what you're doing in each of your jurisdictions. Very exciting. I have a question for Ms. Rubens about Baltimore City, and then a question for the Howard County presenter, whose name I don't have in front of me. But so first on Baltimore City, wherever you have projects where the city is involved in substantial renovations of older housing stock, are you putting in air conditioning? Because that's a bill that I have been working on a couple of years to try to address in older housing stock where there is no air conditioning with our summers that are getting increasingly hot.
Great question. My understanding, I would have to double check with my colleagues in the Home Ownership and Housing Preservation Office, but my understanding is yes. And I do know that we also do a lot of distribution of window units and fans during summer months.
Excellent. I am so glad to hear that. I'm going to talk to you offline further
Would
about
love
my
to.
2026 bill and
Please.
learn more about how you're doing
Yeah.
that. And so I applaud you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Of
And then
course.
thank you. If I could, Mr. Chair, the question for Howard County. So our Howard County presenter, and thank you for your description of what you're doing in your county to address affordability, which is challenging across Maryland, but maybe none more so than Howard. I know you're right up there with probably Montgomery. But anyway, I really am excited to hear you're creating what I would call mixed income housing. So kudos for that. What I want to understand is, because you were talking about AMI below than 80%, and I think you mentioned 60%, maybe even 50%. Can you talk just very briefly about your county's inclusionary zoning law and how prescriptive it is, whether it's really prescriptive, whether you have the flexibility on a project by project basis to set, your AMI threshold at 80 versus 60 or 50? Thank you.
So thank you. My name is Kelly. And of course, our program is very prescriptive. So for the for sale program, there is an 80% maximum. We can do less, but that is the maximum. And our area mean income on January 1 will go to $146,000. So it is very high. We are not as high as Montgomery. We are also at a slight disadvantage because we are part of the Baltimore Metropolitan Statistical Area. So our HUD funding is tied to much lower limits than the Howard County. So we absolutely have projects we can use our federal dollars on and projects we have to use our county dollars on because of that disconnect there. Our rental program under the MI2 program is 60%, but both programs have something called alternative compliance, where we can go down to 40% for the rental, 30% for the rental. We can also do 60 and 40% for the home ownership. Of course, all of those would need some type of county investment, which we also have the ability to do. But the 80% for sale and 60% rental are maximums.
But that's great that there is some flexibility on the rental side, more so, I guess, than the for sale side. Well, good for you. I really love to hear that. And I would also like to talk to you a little bit further offline. And thank you, Kelly. Thank you, all of you, for all you're doing. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Delegate Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to all the presenters. I really appreciate presentations from the Housing professionals in your jurisdictions. And what struck me immediately was how different the conditions are that each of you face. And that underscores for me the necessity of creating public policies that are adaptive for you. So I want you to hear that. Your unique conditions, we hear them. Your unique needs, we see them. And I look forward to working with you to get the best outcomes for everyone. I was struck by the planner from Easton, or sorry, yeah, from Megan Cook. I was struck by your observation that half the population of Talbot County lives in Easton. Is that correct, Megan?
Nearly half the population of the county is in the town of Easton, yes.
That's pretty amazing. And I also appreciated your explanation for why counties have some veto power over municipalities' expansion. That was a good sort of primer on the issue. I think we had legislation on that a year or two ago. I just want you to know that you're heard. My question is for Ms. Rubens in Baltimore City. I appreciate your presentation. Please let Commissioner Kennedy know that I said you did a good job on her behalf. I'm interested in your perspective that by 2053, with the investments in the vacant property model, Baltimore City could increase its revenues by $7 billion a year. Did I hear that right?
Let me double check. It's not just the city, it's the state too. It was modeled city and state revenue.
Great. I wanted to get that clear. That seems important to me because for two reasons. First, it's a demonstration of the linkage between housing production and economic vitality. Secondly, because as you just underscored, that increased economic activity benefits not just the jurisdiction, but the whole state. So that's a really strong argument for assertive and fearless housing production. I love that. And I will be repeating that statistic interminably forever. Thank you.
Please
Those
do.
are my only
I want to
remarks.
just confirm it's sorry, just so you have the right numbers. By 2053, it's 7.4 billion in combined city and state tax revenue.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're
to the
most
presenters.
welcome.
Thank you,
And
Mr.
please reach out directly if you need anything. I'm your data girl.
Awesome. I think
I
we'll
started
now,
as the first fiscal legislative analyst for Council President Jack Young,
awesome.
for those that remember the name.
Awesome. We love legislative analysts. That concludes that panel. We will turn to the Maryland Affordable Housing Coalition. I believe we have Miranda Darden-Williams and Mary Claire Davis. Please go ahead when you are ready.
Just start we just have a couple of quick slides. Okay, I think they're up. Great. Well, good afternoon, Chair Corman and members of the committee. My name is Miranda Darden-Williams, and I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland Affordable Housing Coalition. MAKE was formed 25 years ago to provide advocacy and support for affordable multifamily housing developers and their business partners who develop, build, manage, and finance affordable rental communities across the state for both families and seniors. With me today is Mary Claire Davis, one of my board members, and she's also the VP of Development for Affordable Homes and Communities, a nonprofit Maryland-based affordable housing developer. She's going to talk in more detail about the unique challenges with developing affordable housing, but I wanted to just quickly share a few additional challenges that our industry is facing. As you may know, across the country, affordable rental housing is primarily built and owned by private developers, and it is financed with low-income housing tax credits, which is a federal IRS tax credit program that is administered for the state of Maryland by DHCD. These credits are paired with multiple funding sources that include state loan funds, like you may hear us come every year begging for more rental housing works funding, RHW. That's what makes these deals work. For example, just a few weeks ago at our annual housing awards, we recognized a project in the Johnston Square community that somebody mentioned earlier. It was called the Hammond at Greenmount Park in Baltimore City, that took 18 sources of financing to make that project come to life. So in short, the financing alone for these projects is extremely complex, it's very competitive, and it involves a very lengthy process to secure all of those funding sources. These projects usually take 2 or more years to get approved at the local level once they secure those tax credits and other financing. And the construction cost, the land cost, the financing cost all continue to work against us during that time as they're always increasing. So we're always chasing a growing budget during that time. Additionally, affordable housing developers have a portfolio of properties they developed that are aging, as some of our tax credit properties are now reaching their 30 to 40 year mark. They have a growing list of capital needs, like the need for a new roof or new HVAC systems, paired with increased operating budget demands. So our owners are constantly balancing the challenges of building and investing in new units with the need to address the physical needs of their existing properties. Operating costs like insurance, utilities, maintenance, payroll have all continued to increase sharply, while our rent collections continue to be a challenge. Our existing affordable housing inventory is showing some signs of distress, and our members are struggling to maintain their older and heavily leveraged properties. And we don't expect that to improve much in the near future without additional resources and solutions on the federal, state, and local levels. And all of those factors weigh into a developer's decision to pursue developing more affordable properties in the state, especially in jurisdictions where it is harder and takes longer to get those approvals. So I appreciate you having us today to talk about some of our challenges. We appreciate all of our state partners, and I'll turn it over to Mary Claire to talk in more detail.
Great, thank you, Miranda. Good afternoon. My name is Mary Claire Davis, and I am the Vice President of Real Estate Development for Affordable Homes and Communities. And I thank you for the opportunity to share with the Environment and Transportation Committee today some of our challenges in developing affordable housing. HC is a nonprofit developer, and we are active throughout this region. We have developed and preserved more than 3,300 homes in Maryland over the last 25 years, and we have been active in Virginia and the District of Columbia as well. And as Miranda mentioned, I'm also a board member and co-chair of the Legislative Committee of the Maryland Affordable Housing Coalition. I echo much of what has been shared earlier, including much of the detail provided by Secretary Day about the needs and obstacles to housing creation. And as Miranda touched on, I can say on behalf of my organization and also my colleagues active in Maryland that we have many challenges in our industry. In fact, I think we're at one of our most stressed times in my more than 20-year career in this industry, save the 2000 recession period. Today, I'd like to highlight some of the challenges we face that have a particular burden on creating new affordable housing. First, we have extremely high overall costs, and they often exceed market rate housing. For example, 2 recent developments we completed and started construction on this year in Maryland had a per unit cost that ranged from $500,000 to $700,000. And this is really too high to resolve this problem. Affordable housing financing structures often include very high transaction and legal costs. We often have to use multiple financing sources that generate higher real estate recording costs. And the affordable housing industry often bears the added costs of policy priorities that different financing programs place on it. And like market rate developments, we have very high fees for permitting, utilities, site plans, developer agreements, and bonding with different localities. Another real big issue for us is how long our approval processes are. And that was referenced earlier by Secretary Day in a lot of detail. But I will just attest, to build new units, we often face multiple year entitlement processes. And often affordable housing faces much more scrutiny That leads to multiple reviews, which increases design and engineering costs, and sometimes very long public processes. It is not unusual for a developer like us to incur $2 to $4 million in pre-development expenses for a new construction community. We have to source these funds, which might include added interest costs for amounts that will be outstanding for several years. Added to that, the financing processes for affordable housing can often be lengthy as well, as they include public agencies. So we do think there are some solutions that could help our efforts. Certainty of timelines is one path. We talked a lot about that today with various discussions earlier. If we can understand and rely on a timeline, it can help us with costs and planning and be more efficient. Other solutions can be reductions, waivers, or maybe even a delay of the payment of many governmental fees we're faced with. Something we've heard in other places is that if we want to prioritize affordable housing, can those projects get a quicker review? Can we go to a shorter line if they are providing a valuable resource for Maryland communities? Another help could be automatic pilots for affordable housing that can help with property expense predictability and allow us to borrow more funds to support construction. And finally, we very much appreciate the support we receive from the state of Maryland and often other Maryland localities to help fill the gaps to build affordable housing. But as you heard earlier about the high deficit in housing our state has, the funding that we've received has not been enough to meet that need. We know budgets are tight, but providing more stable housing in the state will create jobs and keep Marylanders here that will contribute to our overall economic revenue. So we really do thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and we appreciate the committee's interest in advancing and solving housing needs with us. And we're happy to answer any questions or provide any more information that's helpful.
Great, thank you both very much. I do not see any hands raised, but thank you again for being with us. We really appreciate it. And we will turn to our final panel, which is broadly called Maryland Building Industry Association, although I think there's only one direct MBIA employee on here. We've got Lori Graff from MBIA, Andrew Welker, Osterman Properties, Casey Anderson, Rogers Consulting, and Bobby Thompson, Thompson Group Ventures. So Lori, I'll let you conduct your own panel, and then we'll take questions at the end.
Great, thank you. Let me go ahead and start our slideshow. Okay, hello, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today. The chair obviously introduced our panel. I'm going to be relatively quick to get to them because we're going to give a couple of case studies that will show some examples, some real life examples of what is going on in the industry. I've been really diving into a lot of data. We've talked a lot about data. I'm certainly going to share some things with you guys offline to save some time today. But I did want to make sure everybody has read the comptroller's report on housing. It's really eye-opening. It really does talk about economics and the economic development and housing and how it needs to be tied together. So I would encourage everybody to read that. I would also encourage everybody to look into some Pew research that was done, kind of answer some of the questions that Delegate Ruth had earlier. Yes, we have to build, in many cases, we have to build at a price point that's a little bit higher. However, when you build at a higher price point, it does lower rents in other areas and older housing stock that are around it. We have lots of data on that, and I'm happy to share that with the committee. But for time's sake, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Andrew Welker, who is with Osterman Properties, which is a multifamily developer, primarily in Frederick. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Lori. Everyone can hear me okay. And Lori, I'm going to ask you to click through the slides so we're not changing presenters as we go. So this was a presentation I did a few weeks ago. I'm going to try and condense it from 45 minutes down into 5 minutes. So this is a very and hyper-specific case study in Frederick, Maryland. It's one that I've been working on for 3 years. We are a small local developer. Our only market of focus is Frederick County, and a lot of our work has been within the city of Frederick in Frederick County. This particular project, which I said we started working on 3 years ago, would have, as the term was used earlier in the presentation, penciled in 2023 and probably late into or early 2024. Under today's market conditions, it does not pencil. So what I'm hoping is that when we get to the end, and we're going to do this quickly, is that everyone can kind of understand where the costs are broken down. I can't spend as much time on the cost drivers on each of those categories. But this is basically an infill site in Frederick County, Maryland, actually within the city of Frederick. It's greenfield, hasn't been previously developed, but because it's an infill site surrounded by existing residential and commercial projects, it has the benefit of being close to existing infrastructure, roads, sewer, and water. It's a it's a 3-building, 4-story project, 112 apartments total in those 3 buildings. Surface parked and no off-site improvements are required. So you'll see total costs here will not translate to any other project, I think, in Frederick County. And certainly hearing some of the numbers that were discussed about other jurisdictions, this is not a number that you could probably take and replicate somewhere else. We target 100% AMI as a rental rate that we are targeting. So all of our underwriting is based on trying to hit that 100% AMI target for rents. If you could go to the next slide, Lori. So starting with the land costs, seeing as this is suburban infill, a lot of the available land, they have flexible zoning or use flexible zoning techniques, which is great because the projects or those particular parcels can be improved as the market demands. What it does do is kind of drive up the competition when you're looking to acquire that land. So one thing to keep in mind is if land can be developed as either a data center or a biotech manufacturer or as multifamily mixed-use development, then you are also competing with other markets as they balloon and grow and blossom and get more attention. And we do find that to be the case, that we're often competing with the other very aggressive or expanding asset class. For this particular county, we're seeing unimproved land values between $500,000 and $3 million per acre, depending on how close you are to the center of city of Frederick. For this particular project, our land acquisition cost came at $32,500 per unit. Next slide. Soft costs, this is survey and legal. We had to do a zoning Board of Appeals, conditional use approval for residential on this particular site planning, civil engineering, and building design. Worked out to about $11,000 per unit. Next. And then before we are fully permitted and shovel ready, we have fees and mitigation fees and other regulations, building permit fees to pay. Typically ranges from $60,000 to $100,000 per dwelling unit. In our case, we're on the lower end. We were lucky with fortunate that our schools had capacity and our school mitigation fees were limited at this location. Again, because we were near existing infrastructure, our APFO impact fees and mitigation fees were de minimis and required no off-site improvements. So per permit, we range from $60,000 to about $100,000. And in this case, we're on the lower end of that range. Next. Financing costs. This is just to capture loan costs for origination fees and interest expense from when we start to accumulate our debt until we stabilize a project and it is finally cash flowing. Next. And then construction costs. This is a mid-rise apartment project in Frederick County. Our construction costs, we've priced this 1, 2, 3, 4 times over the last 3 years. It has never gone down in price every time we price it. We have seen construction costs increase by about 40 to 45% over the last 6 or 7 years. So sometimes I wonder why we keep pricing things. We know what the answer is going to be. It's going to be more expensive than it was the last time based on labor and labor shortages and material costs. Next slide. So somebody went over this development life cycle. I think Secretary Day actually alluded to this 5-year time frame, and that's consistent with what we dealt with on this project or are still dealing with on this project. Land acquisition and pre-development, in this case, zoning board of appeals and conditional use approval so that we could do a residential project on this site took a year. There was lots of opposition on the front end of that. So we had to, not slow, but we had to be very deliberate, methodical through that approval process. Then we have our site plan and then our civil engineering plans and building design, about a year for each of those steps in that 2-year pre-development design and entitlements category. Then we seek financing, we seek investor dollars. Right now, it's virtually impossible to get anybody to take their attention off of the S&P 500, not interested in alternative investment asset classes like a risky ground-up development in a second-tier market in suburban Maryland. And then when we finally do get to construction, approximately 18 months to start bringing units out of the ground and delivering and opening doors for renters. It typically takes, in this market, about 9 months to fully lease up and stabilize a project. So we time our deliveries in late Q1 so that we have the benefit of a full lease up season to reach that stabilization within the 9 months. And during that stabilization period, that you are there's more money going out the door in operating expenses than is coming in rents, and that's where that $2,000 per unit average lease up and stabilization cost comes in play. And then you're operating the building, for 3 years minimum before you are either exiting. If you are trying to, in our case, we are self-funding a lot of our projects and we only invest in Frederick. So it often takes an asset sale in order for us to work on the next project and continue to do work in Frederick. You can go to the next slide. So that is kind of the overall development time frame. In this case, total cost of one mid-rise apartment unit, $383,000. Market rent for a new apartment, $2,200 a month. That, depending if you're using the 36X method or the 40X method to determine affordability, that is an AMI of $79,000 to $88,000 per year. So that could either be a two-person household making approximately $90,000, or it could be an individual. We target those rents. You back out our operating expenses for property management, our cleaning, snow removal, common area lights, etc., taxes, and that would require, or in this case, a $383,000 apartment unit rented at $2,200 a month would take 18 years to pay back on investment using a simple, untrended, not accounting for debt service repayment or I guess schedule. Under the current market conditions, rent would need to be $3,000, so significantly higher for an 8% return, or we would need to reduce our costs by 27% or approximately $100,000 in order for this to pencil. Now, obviously, there are some things you can do with financing and debt, but unless you are in better position than an 8% return, you can't borrow money for less than 8% and make the numbers improve. So simple breakdown in our scenario, land is about 10% of the total cost, design and permits and approvals is about 20% of the cost, construction 65%, and financing and carrying costs about 5% of the total project costs. I know that was a rip through of the information. Like I said, I went through this in 45 minutes in a housing symposium a few weeks ago, and I'm going to hand it over to Casey Anderson at Rogers Consulting to discuss our next topic.
Thanks very much. And as Andrew said, different jurisdictions have different costs. In Montgomery County, you could probably put another $100,000, $125,000 a unit on those numbers. Recent affordable, subsidized housing, affordable housing in Montgomery County has been about $500,000 a unit in suburban locations. This is an image of the Lutherville Mark Station in Baltimore County. It's sort of held up as a poster child for what's wrong with zoning at the local level. But what I want to talk about is, in addition to zoning, the interaction that land use regulation has with other requirements like environmental law, desire for things like public parks, public infrastructure like roads, and the cumulative effect that has on the availability of land. Next slide. That's the everything bagel. And I show this because I think the problem often is, and we've heard a lot today about process and delay, and a lot of questions about how could we speed things up. That would be great if we could speed things up. But ultimately, if we have layer upon layer of substantive regulation, even the most expeditious review processes are still going to leave us with high cost housing because we're asking housing development to do a lot of different things. Next slide. This is the priority funding area map for the state. And the point I want to make here is that most of the state is really zoned and planned for low density development, usually less than, at or below 1 lot per acre in cases where residential development is allowed. The colored areas on this map are the priority funding areas, which is supposed to be where more intensive development occurs. Even in the close-in suburbs of Baltimore and DC, you can see that maybe a third of to half of Montgomery County is in principle available for higher intensity development. Most of the other close-in counties are similar. Next slide. That would be okay if those were the only constraints. This is a map that Montgomery Planning did about a little over 10 years ago, looking at development constraints on the land. And you'll see the upper, the northwest parts of the county are set aside for agriculture. The other shaded in areas are various other restrictions: land that's in public ownership, land that's in forest conservation easements, historic preservation, public right-of-way, schools, and single-family detached zoning. So the amount of land that's already been developed with single-family houses. So the holes in the Swiss cheese that are left over are the places that are, at least in theory, available for additional housing or other forms of development. Next slide. When we drilled down about 5 or 6 years ago to look at putting more housing near transit, and that's been the focus at the state level with Secretary Day and Governor Moore have succeeded, and you've supported legislation to, in some cases, preempt local zoning around transit with the idea that, well, if we're going to have more housing, it probably ought to be, or optimally would be, located next to transit. What this table shows that is in a place like Montgomery County, we've already pretty fully exploited the zoning envelope around metro stations. So yes, we want to put as much development near transit as possible, but there's very little land near transit, at least in the close-in suburbs in Montgomery. That's not always true next to MARC stations in the Baltimore area, or in some cases in Prince George's County, but it's clear that we cannot make a major dent, much less solve our housing problem, simply by focusing on housing a quarter to half a mile from transit. Next slide. This is the image of one of the last remaining large properties in Montgomery County that is relatively unconstrained. And I've been working on this with the planning department in Montgomery County on behalf of the property owner. I think this illustrates the problem that once you've set aside huge chunks of land for agriculture or conservation and confine the available development footprint to a much smaller area, and then you start layering on additional requirements, you wind up with very little land that's left to develop. So this is a 200-acre property. You can see the stream valley in the green over there to the right is unbuildable, obviously. There's a public road in sort of a mauve or orange color along the edge of that stream valley, just to the left, and that cuts off big parts of the parcel that can't be developed. You can see the planning department wanted to impose a 200-foot setback from I-270, wanted an 8 to 12 acre public park. That's the beige or light tan area right in the middle. There's purple, which are the public streets that are going to be included. The planning department asked that we not cut down any of the forest stands that are in the middle of the site. Those are the dotted areas. And they also wanted to add 35% green cover to the remaining parts of the site. So what looked like a 208-acre site or 203-acre site at the beginning of the process, the planning department proposed cutting that down to less than a quarter of that land area. You see that 49.6 acres remaining. Now, I'm not here to tell you that these are unreasonable requests, or that they're bad ideas to preserve more trees, or to add green cover or to build, and it's necessary to build roads. We need public parks. We need other forms of public infrastructure. But what I'm saying is that when you take huge parts of the land area of the major jurisdictions around DC and Baltimore and you place them off limits to development, and then you start adding cumulatively additional constraints on the land, what you wind up with is a shortage of land that's available for housing. So if this site were developed with all townhouses, every acre of land that's taken off the table is probably another 10 housing units. We're not talking about high-rise development here because the market won't support that at this location. So basically, you're talking about a very relatively medium density horizontal form of development that is significantly constrained by the additional asks that we're getting from state and local government in order to be able to build. Next slide. It matters if we can build townhouses. Because the only way to solve the land shortage problem is either to free up more land for development, which nobody wants to do because we don't want to take farmland or forests or other areas that have been set aside for conservation, or you can allow more development on the same land area. Many people seem to have an issue with even moderate levels of intensification, but it really matters for affordability. This chart shows you the closing sale price of every new subdivision in Prince George's County from second quarter of last year. I just happened to have that data, so I threw it together. What you see is even in a place like Prince George's County, which is more affordable than Montgomery, maybe even a little more affordable than Frederick, new single-family detached houses are selling for $700,000, $800,000, $900,000. Many new subdivisions are north of $1 million. If you are talking about townhouses can be delivered in Prince George's County for high fours, low fives, and routinely are. So if we're going to make a dent in the attainable housing problem, which is not people at 80% or below of area median income, it's people who make 80% to say 120% of area median income, we're going to need to be able to have a wider variety of housing types. Many planners love the idea of missing middle with a lot of really funky building typologies like cottage courts and stacked flats, and they love these, really exotic designs. But I guess what I'm here to tell you is that the plain old townhouse is the original missing middle, and you can do a lot of good by having zoning that accommodates more townhouses. Next slide. I want to just poke a couple of bears here. There's been a lot of discussion about private equity and other institutional investors buying up single-family houses. I don't really have any issue with regulating this, but I don't think anybody should be confused about the likelihood that that's going to make a dent in the problem. There are about 300,000 single-family homes in the entire country that are owned by institutional investors. There's more than 300,000 housing units in Prince George's County alone, or in Baltimore County alone. So really, a number of single-family homes that have been acquired by institutional investors is not anywhere close to the number that would be necessary for those institutional investors to exercise leverage on house prices. Now, there may be reasons to regulate this, but I think that what's clear, as Jake Day had said a little bit earlier, is institutional investors are buying up houses in places where supply is constrained because the fact that there is little competition for new supply is the surest guarantee that their investments will pay off. I think that if we don't address supply and instead look to restrictions on institutional investment, you're really going to be barking up the wrong tree. The other issue, which seems to come quite a bit, and is sometimes related, is the idea that we should punish landowners for either failing to fully develop their property or holding units vacant. This is not a thing in real estate development. Developers do not profit from vacant units. You hear a lot of this sort of urban legends about apartment buildings that are luxury apartments that are built and held empty because supposedly the people who develop them are making money by writing off on their taxes. You can deduct your losses on those types of real estate investments, that does not put you ahead. No real estate developer in their right mind wants to see vacant units, and if they don't think they can rent them out, they're not going to build them. When you start trying to legislate to make it to punish development that is either where there are vacant units or the land is not exploiting the zoning that's available, you're basically going to increase the risk and cost of holding that property, investing in property, which makes it more difficult and expensive to build housing. So really our message is, if what you're worried about is land that's sitting idle or people hoarding properties to try to jack up rents, the answer is to encourage predictability, not to try to punish the people that own the land. And that means some of the things we talked about today, like streamlining approvals, regulatory certainty, funding infrastructure, all those things are really helpful to facilitating supply, which not only reduces prices, but also reduces the power of people like institutional investors to exercise leverage on prices in the market. And with that, I'm going to hand it off.
Thank you, Casey. And thank you to the chairman and the committee for the time to speak today. One of the things I wanted to highlight is that I know we're showing case studies specific to certain jurisdictions, but rest assured that all of the examples that are being provided today by this panel are relevant to every jurisdiction. All the cost change, all of the layers of the Smith Island cake referencing the comptroller's report are there. And it varies from place to place. If you look at the top 9 counties that new home construction is viable, that will address our housing crisis, you're going to see the same telltale signals. And the keys to our attainability in each of these 9 and furthermore throughout the state are going to be the regulatory certainty, what you see on the slide here. And now that 5-year span that you've heard multiple groups reference today, it holds true. Imagine, if you will, if you wanted to put an investment of your capital, your own hard-earned money or your own subsidy money into something that has shifting sands and shifting requirements, it's going to change. And that penciling that we've been referencing is no longer viable. And so when we do that, it all goes to the unattainability bottom line to make up for those changes and those additions of layers. So when we're thinking about pragmatically identifying certain housing types or certain requirements of those housing types, everything that you add in, and I believe Secretary Day referenced some good legislation that I know it was well intended, that came across with certain specifics or prescriptive things to add to a home, but they all have a cost associated with them. So a one that is popping up in most jurisdiction pattern books today to reference is the inclusion of full brick fronts and multiple brick sides. All of that, because of the perceived value of masonry, has a cost associated with it. And so if you increase the $20,000 elevation type, $20,000 elevation type, it now makes what could price some folks from being able to purchase that home. And so when you think of the things that are prescriptive in specific legislation, specific jurisdictions, you have to understand that housing for all will take varying housing types. It will take some certainty for us to be able to understand what those costs on capital employed will actually be. So that way we can address where we're missing the median income, where we're missing, where we can actually do some improvement on the ability to purchase. Right now we're in a softened market. And you're absolutely right in some of the speeches that we've had and some of the spokespersons that we've had from different government affiliations is that folks are leaving because they cannot afford to be here. And so it will take the varying housing types across all of our jurisdictions to have housing for all, so that way we can get the attainability addressed appropriately to keep them here. And I'm saying this to you from a builder perspective, having built all over the state with multiple national, regional, and local home builders. It is something that we need to address with all the voices that you've heard today. And I love that we're having these conversations up front ahead of session. And I think that if we can reduce all of these additional layers that we've added and reduce all of the things that are increasing the cost and do it in a pragmatic way, like we're having these tough conversations with one another. And when we get into session, we don't forget this content and that we have these allies in the room to address this as a group, because it's going to take all of us sharing this content, sharing this information, and addressing it appropriately to get to our end result, which is more housing.
Great. Thank you all very much. I do not see any hands raised, which is unbelievable. I must have worn the committee out with all of these speakers. I do want to say this was a great briefing. It was amazing. We talked about this for almost 3 hours and very little discussion was around zoning. And I know there was an agreement, but there was a lot of discussion about issues that I think many of you I've heard raise beyond zoning. And of course, by going on for that length of time, Delegate Lewis popped up with a question. Delegate Lewis?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I may, just quickly, thank the builders for taking the time to come and explain to us what their real experiences are like. For a lot of us, let me speak for myself, I had no idea about the excruciating torments you guys undergo just to create housing for our constituents to live in. Thank you for that. I did want to ask Mr. Anderson about your perspectives on institutional investors. Really quickly, you shared a statistic, if I heard you right, that there are about 300,000 single-family homes nationwide owned by institutional investors. Meanwhile, there's hundreds of millions of single-family homes nationwide owned by regular people, or whatever. How does that institutional investor property profile look for multifamily properties? Would you know off the top of your head? Is it very different?
It is very different because typically, if you have a 200-unit apartment building, there's not many individuals that, can own a large apartment building outright. I understand most of the criticism that's focused in institutional investment in residential real estate is about single-family homes. And sometimes that gets tied to the idea that they're buying up these houses and exercising market power over that housing such that they can raise prices. And I don't think there's any evidence that they can do that because they don't own a significant share of all housing units, never mind single-family housing units. But I think it kind of is actually, sometimes it's not articulated, but sometimes I think this is about discomfort with the idea that single-family homes are for individuals to build wealth. And the idea that if we take single-family homes and make them an institutional investment product, it's not even so much that they raise the prices or make the rents unaffordable, but that those houses are no longer available for individuals to buy as a way to accumulate capital and savings and, a retirement nest egg. So I think if that's what's going on, and sometimes I hear that argument, sometimes it sort of gets mixed up with these other ideas, which I don't think are very well factually supported, then I think that's a reasonable thing we should talk about. But I just think I want to just make it clear to the committee that if anyone is tempted to say, okay, we're going to try to take a stab at solving the housing affordability problem by restricting institutional investment in residential real estate, particularly single-family homes, and let's see if that does anything, I'm saying you're going to have really missed an opportunity and wasted another year or two when other things that would have been more helpful to affordability would have been more fruitful to pursue. Now, that's not to say you couldn't address this issue of how are people going to get to own a home, but I think it's important to keep that as a separate question for what kind of policy you want to adopt, because these are actually two different things that in some ways are not only unrelated, but some of the legislative solutions may get in the way of other things that are more productive for dealing with our affordability problems. I know that's a lot to get your mind around, but I hope that answers your question.
It definitely helps. Mr. Chair, thank you, Mr. Anderson, and to the panel very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Great. I would just submit to all of you that there is no one solution, and we do 2,500 bills a year. So we've got plenty of ability to deal with multiple different challenges. Just a reminder, the committee will be participating in another briefing on Tuesday at 9:30 a.m. Sorry, it might be Monday. Next week at 9:30 a.m. On recent federal actions impacting climate and energy policy in Maryland, and that's on Monday, December 15th at 9:30 a.m. See you all then. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you all again to our panelists.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.